In the silent heart of the imperial palace, where mighty custodians stood like golden statues beside ancient pillars, a strange pulse of light flickered across the surface of the golden throne, as if reality itself drew in a breath. And at that very moment, every sensor on Terra began to fail, every warning rune glowed red, and an eerie tremor rolled through the throne room, causing even the bravest warriors of the Emperor to tense because something was happening that should not be possible. Deep inside the golden throne, behind layers of machinery older than most civilizations, the Emperor of Mankind felt a spark of awareness return to him. A spark that had been silent for 10,000 years. And with that spark came a slow rise of strength that spread out like a wave through the warp, brushing against distant stars, touching the minds of psychers across the Imperium, making them gasp as if a great weight had pressed down upon their spirits. While far beyond the palace walls, across hundreds of worlds, astropaths felt the sudden surge of psychic pressure and collapsed with confused terror, unsure whether this was a sign of salvation or the beginning of humanity's final hour. And as the tremor reached its peak, the Emperor's eyes opened with a sudden golden blaze so bright that the custodians guarding him stumbled backward, blinded for a heartbeat, unable to comprehend that the eyes of their master, long dim and frozen in an unending vigil, now stared forward with fire, purpose, and something else that none of them had ever witnessed, a strange mixture of calm determination and deep, ancient sorrow, as if he carried the weight of every death, every war, every broken world inside him. The machinery around the throne shrieked with sparks as overloaded pylons shorted out one by one, showering the floor with burning fragments. And the Astronomican Humanity's psychic lighthouse flickered wildly across the galaxy, causing Imperial ships to drift off course, lose their bearings, or halt entirely as their navigators screamed and clutched their heads, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the psychic tides. And as the golden light filled the chamber, the Emperor slowly lifted one hand, shaking with strain as though even this simple motion demanded immense energy. But when his fingers curled around the armrest of the throne, the custodians moved forward, unsure whether they should help him or kneel, torn between ancient protocols and the instinctive awe of witnessing their master truly awake for the first time since the Horus Heresy. Outside the chamber, alarms blared throughout the palace, echoing down massive hallways, summoning squads of Adeptus Custodes and Sisters of Silence who felt a strange pressure push against their minds like a rising storm. And even though they were trained to remain calm under any situation, they could not shake the feeling that something enormous, something beyond the understanding of mortals, was unfolding within the throne room. Far across Terra, common citizens paused in their daily routines, sensing a sudden warmth in the air as if the sun itself had moved closer and far beyond. Terra, on distant imperial worlds, people looked up at the sky and whispered prayers as a faint but unmistakable golden glow spread across the night, confusing priests and terrifying rebels who did not know what omen this represented. Deep within the warp, demons recoiled with furious howls, their forms warping and twisting as the Emperor's awakening burned them like fire. And the Chaos Gods felt the shift as clearly as any mortal might feel a knife pressed against their throat. Their reaction a mixture of rage, shock, and instinctive fear, for this was not part of their endless games, and the return of their greatest enemy was a threat none of them had predicted. On Macragge, Raboot Gilliman froze in the middle of a war council as a blast of psychic energy burst through the sky above him, forming a brief silhouette of golden wings before fading into nothing, and he felt a powerful tremor run through his soul, a realization forming instantly in his mind. His father was awake, and the galaxy would never be the same again. On Craft World, Ulthar, Farseers dropped their wraithbone staffs as visions shattered in their minds, turning all futures into chaos, giving them nothing but static and swirling shadows when they tried to peer ahead, forcing Eldrad to acknowledge that something had changed so drastically that even prophecy itself trembled on the brink of collapse. In the far corners of the galaxy, Tyranid hive fleets shifted their courses as if guided by an unseen hand. Necron Tomb worlds stirred with ancient protocols, and Orc warlords roared with joy, believing some new enemy worthy of their excitement had finally appeared. And all the while the Emperor continued to rise slow and deliberate as the custodians hurried forward to support him, but they stopped when he gently raised a hand, signaling them not to interfere, his voice echoing in their minds, not in words but in certainty that he could manage even if it cost him what little strength he had regained. As he lifted himself from the throne, the ground shook again. Distant machinery groaned, And hidden beneath the layers of the device, ancient mechanisms began to open like rusted jaws, revealing something the custodians had never seen before. Cracks in reality, small tears glowing with faint warp energy, drifting like smoke, and the Emperor stared at them with deep remorse. For he understood what they meant. If he had not awakened now, the Golden Throne would have failed completely, and the Imperium would have collapsed into darkness within mere decades. He stepped forward, each movement sending a wave of psychic pressure across the chamber, bending the air like heat. And when his foot touched the ground, the small warp tier nearest to him shrank rapidly before sealing itself with a flash of golden light. But the effort made him sway, forcing him to grip the arm of a custodian to keep himself steady. And though he recovered quickly, the custodians exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether their emperor was truly healed or merely burning the last fragments of his life to delay the doom threatening mankind. He lifted his gaze toward the sealed doors of the throne room, sensing the countless lives outside, millions across Terra, trillions across the Imperium, each one a tiny spark of hope or despair. And for the first time in millennia, the Emperor felt a sharp, painful awareness of his people's suffering, their fear, their blind faith, and he realized how much had changed in his absence, how far humanity had fallen, how deeply the Imperium had twisted into something he had never intended. And though he wanted to speak to reassure his guardians, to tell them the path ahead, he also knew that words alone would not be enough, for what was coming would demand more strength, more sacrifice, and more unity than humanity had shown since the dawn of the Great Crusade. The Emperor took another step, steady but heavy with purpose, and as he did, the Astronomicon brightened. Across the galaxy, stabilizing fleets, guiding lost ships back on course, restoring hope to countless worlds. Even as the warp itself roared in anger, sending waves of psychic turbulence crashing against distant stars, but despite this violent response, the Emperor did not waver, for he knew that his awakening was only the beginning, that something ancient and terrible had stirred in response to him, something that had been waiting for this moment, and though he could sense its presence lurking at the edge of the galaxy like a shadow preparing to strike, he also felt a faint glimmer of victory deep within himself, for as long as he drew breath, humanity still had a chance, and he would not allow the Imperium to fall without a final stand that would shake the stars. The golden light around the Emperor slowly faded into a softer glow, but the pressure in the warp continued to rise like a storm swelling beneath black clouds. And as he stepped farther away from the Golden Throne, the custodians followed him with caution, unsure whether to treat him as a fragile relic or the unstoppable master they had always served. Yet even in his weakened state, the Emperor radiated a quiet power that made the air hum with energy, causing every servo skull and hovering drone in the chamber to malfunction or flee. And though the custodians were trained to remain silent, one of them, Commander Trajan Valores, finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with awe as he asked his emperor what they should do next. But the Emperor did not answer immediately, for he was listening, not to voices in the room but to the distant cries of humanity echoing through the warp, a chorus of fear, hope, worship, and despair that filled his senses with overwhelming force. He raised his hand slowly, and the custodians felt a sudden vibration under their feet, as if something massive deep within the planet had shifted, and then the sealed doors of the throne room opened by themselves, their ancient mechanisms grinding and screeching until they slid aside to reveal hundreds of Sisters of Silence kneeling in absolute silence, their blank psychic presence forming a protective wall around the Emperor as expanding aura. He walked past them, each step echoing like a thunderclap, and every sister bowed deeply as he passed, their minds untouched by the psychic tide that had thrown so many others into chaos. Outside, the great halls of the palace were in turmoil, with rushing tech priests chanting hurried prayers as machinery overloaded, while Adeptus Arbites struggled to control panicking crowds who had felt the psychic quake that signaled the Emperor's awakening. And above them all, towering stained glass windows glowed brighter than ever before, as if reacting to their creator's return. The Emperor paused briefly, sensing the fear and confusion across Terra, and then he stretched out his hand, releasing a calm wave of psychic energy that swept across the palace and out into the planet. As atmosphere quieting minds and steadying hearts, bringing order where moments earlier there had been chaos, and the custodians behind him felt their own fears soothed as if a cold hand had been lifted from their chests. Far beyond Terra, the effect was even stronger. Imperial Guard regiments suddenly ceased panicking. Space Marines felt renewed purpose, and civilian riots ended in seconds as people collapsed in tears. of awe, sensing a presence of pure authority and impossible strength wash over them. At that same instant, Robert Guilliman's fleet entered the Sol system, its ships shaken by the Astronomican's instability, and when Guilliman stepped onto the bridge of his flagship, he felt a psychic pull, gentle but absolute, drawing him toward Terra, and though he was the Lord Commander of the Imperium for the first time, he felt like a child being summoned by a father he had not spoken to in 10,000 years. As Guilliman's fleet accelerated toward Terra, the Emperor continued his slow march through the palace, heading toward the outer balconies where he could view the ancient sprawl of his capital world, and as he reached the balcony, the sight before him filled him with both pride and sorrow. Endless layers of rooftops, towers piercing the clouds, billions of lights flickering like stars trapped inside the planet, and above them, the dark sky shimmering with golden waves from the Astronomican as it tried to stabilize under his renewed control. The Emperor gripped the railing tightly, sensing the immense suffering woven through every street of Terra, the fear, the hunger, the oppression, and he felt a pang of regret so sharp it echoed through the warp, sending ripples across the galaxy that made demons shriek, as if struck by a burning brand. Below the balcony, millions of citizens had gathered, kneeling, crying, praying, some raising their hands and shouting his name, while others simply stared in disbelief, because the golden figure on the balcony was unmistakably the Emperor, alive, awake, radiating strength, and every person felt the same impossible truth. Something sacred had just shifted in the universe. But while humanity rejoiced, chaos reacted with pure fury. Across the Eye of Terror, demonic storms exploded outward, tearing rifts in reality, and a massive shadow began to take shape, swirling with hatred and boiling with power, a presence so old and terrible that even the Chaos Gods took notice, recognizing the signature of a threat long forgotten, something that had slumbered in the hidden corners of the warp, waiting for the Emperor to awaken so it could rise and answer. The Emperor sensed that shadow forming and tightened his grip on the railing, understanding that his awakening had triggered this reaction, that his presence had awakened not only hope in humanity, but also an ancient enemy that had remained dormant for millennia, feeding on the chaos and fear of the galaxy. He turned away from the balcony and spoke for the first time with true voice, not psychic whisper, but actual sound, his words echoing across the entire palace as he commanded the custodians to prepare for a coming war unlike anything the Imperium had ever faced, and his voice carried through the warp, reaching Guilliman instantly, filling him with both relief and dread. Guilliman's fleet landed on Terra minutes later, and he rushed through the palace, pushing past guards who bowed in shock at seeing him in such a hurry, and when he finally reached the balcony, he stopped dead in his tracks as the Emperor turned to face him, their eyes meeting for the first time in 10,000 years, creating a moment so powerful that every psyker in the galaxy felt a sudden jolt, as if the entire timeline had shifted. Guilliman knelt overwhelmed, but the Emperor placed a hand on his shoulder, lifting him gently and telling him that there was no time for ceremony, no time for reflection, and no time for hesitation, because the galaxy was moving toward a breaking point that humanity could not survive without unity. He told Guilliman that the Golden Throne had been dying for centuries, that his awakening was the only thing keeping it stable, but even now the machine was on the verge of collapse. And once it failed completely, the warp rifts beneath it would burst open and consume Terra in a storm that could destroy the entire Imperium. Guilliman felt fear tighten in his chest, not for himself but for humanity, and he asked what they needed to do. But before the Emperor could answer, a new tremor shook the palace, this one far stronger than the last, causing statues to crack, walls to split, and distant alarms to scream. And both the Emperor and Guilliman looked up as the sky above Terra darkened unnaturally, swirling with a massive shadow so vast it blocked the stars, its presence so heavy that even the custodians felt their hearts pound with instinctive terror. The Emperor closed his eyes for a moment, sensing the shape of the threat forming in the warp, and when he opened them again, the golden light in them burned brighter and harsher than before, as if preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of creation itself. And though Guilliman did not yet understand the nature of this enemy, he could see in the Emperor's expression that the true war, the one hidden behind 10,000 years of conflict, was finally beginning. As lightning crackled through the sky and the shadow pressed closer, the Emperor stepped forward, raising his hand toward the heavens, and with a single gesture he unleashed a blast of psychic energies so massive that the entire planet trembled and every ship in orbit reeled from the shockwave. But even this immense power was not enough to chase the shadow away completely, for it only retreated slightly before swirling back into place, as if gathering strength. Gilliman took a step closer to his father, ready to fight at his side, but the Emperor whispered that this was merely the first sign that the true form of the enemy had yet to appear, and that the next hours would decide whether humanity would rise, stronger than ever, or fall into eternal darkness. The Emperor's awakening continued to send tremors through the Imperium as the golden light around the golden throne grew brighter. And deep within the palace, sensors cracked under the pressure of raw psychic power that had been silent for 10,000 years, while custodians stood frozen, unsure whether to kneel or prepare for battle as the impossible unfolded. Across Terra, ordinary citizens felt strange emotions: fear, hope, confusion, because they sensed something ancient and powerful stirring. And the Astronomicon itself pulsed like a beating heart, flashing brighter than a star, surprising every navigator in the galaxy as their minds filled with visions of a towering figure walking through endless war. And out on the battlefields of 1,000 worlds, Space Marines suddenly felt a burning strength inside their genetic memory. A whisper commanding them to stand ready, and as fleets drifted in the void, their astropaths screamed with joy and horror as golden fire rushed through their minds, showing them the Emperor's shadow rising across the warp. And inside the throne room, the custodian captain took one step forward, unsure whether this was a miracle or the beginning of another catastrophe, and he watched as the Emperor's hand slowly lifted from the armrest, fingers trembling like someone fighting a great unseen force, while the air turned heavy and hot, and psychic pressure pushed everyone to their knees. And alarms outside the palace erupted as Mechanicus priests panicked at the readings showing the Golden Throne, collapsing into an unstable state between life and death. But before anyone could act, a deep voice echoed through the mindscape, not through ears but through souls, declaring that the long night was not yet over. And in that moment, traitor psychers across the galaxy burst into flames as they felt a presence too powerful to resist, while ordinary chaos cultists fell to the ground shaking as shadows curled away from them like frightened animals. And in the warp, a great storm began to twist apart as if someone was tearing open a curtain, revealing a path of burning gold cutting through madness itself, and every demon lord paused, sensing their greatest enemy rising again, their roar shaking entire warp realms, while in the Imperium, people stared at the sky as strange golden auroras spread across worlds that had not seen sunlight in centuries. And aboard a distant black ship, an astropath collapsed as her eyes glowed bright white, and she whispered the impossible truth to her terrified crew. "He is walking." And back on Terra, the Emperor's eyes flickered open once more, this time brighter, steadier, filled with a cold and ancient determination, as if he had just returned from a battle older than time. And the custodians, unable to stand under the psychic weight, pressed their heads to the floor as the Emperor's gaze scanned the room like a god preparing to judge the living. And in that single heartbeat, every mind across the Imperium felt something: an order, a warning, a promise that the galaxy was about to face a storm unlike anything it had ever known. As the Emperor stood from the Golden Throne, the entire room shook like a storm had entered the palace, and the custodians felt their armor vibrate from the sheer power leaking from his body, while across Terra, millions dropped to their knees as a sudden wave of golden energy swept through the atmosphere, clearing the polluted sky for the first time in centuries and letting sunlight fall on the capital world with unnatural brightness. Deep within the Mechanicus catacombs, tech priests screamed as their machines overloaded, showing impossible readings that suggested the Emperor was no longer bound by the limits of the human form and out in space. Imperial ships drifting above Terra experienced sudden system resets, their machine spirits struggling to understand the overwhelming psychic signal that now radiated from the throne room, like a beacon of pure command. And as the Emperor took his second step, the floor beneath him cracked, not from weight, but from power refining itself inside him, changing, evolving, becoming something that the galaxy had never seen. And on countless worlds, soldiers froze mid-battle as visions of the Emperor walking through fire flashed through their minds, filling them with courage and dread at the same time. Meanwhile, on the chaos side of the warp, the ruinous powers felt their realms tremble as if the foundation of their existence was being challenged, and the greater demons howled in rage, fearing the ancient enemy they once thought chained forever to a dying machine. While Abaddon aboard the vengeful spirit sensed the shift and gripped his demon blade as a cold fury washed over him, forcing him to admit that the end of the Long War might finally be approaching. And in the distant corners of the galaxy, Xenos empires felt the change too. The Eldar heard Their farseers gasped as they saw new futures forming like cracks in glass that thaw water. Cast received strange dreams of a burning figure crossing the stars, and the orcs cheered without understanding why, simply excited by the promise of a bigger fight. Back on Terra, the Emperor finally spoke, his voice echoing not through air but through the very souls of those present, commanding them to rise, and every custodian obeyed. Instantly, even though fear and awe shook their hearts, and the Emperor lifted his hand, revealing golden flames swirling around, his palm like living light. Flames that whispered ancient languages no one could fully understand, and at that moment every psyker in the Imperium collapsed to the ground as their minds filled with the same message, a command that the Imperium must prepare for a war greater than the Horus Heresy, a war that would pull every world, every species, and every soul into its center, for the Emperor had returned not to rule, but to finish something he started 10,000 years ago, and the galaxy felt the weight of that purpose. Like a storm spreading across the stars, unstoppable and terrifying. The moment the Emperor stepped forward again, the entire palace felt alive with energy, and the custodians watched as golden light flowed from his armor like a river breaking through stone, casting long shadows across the vast hall, while alarms began to echo throughout Terra as thousands of sensors, scanners, and augurs detected impossible levels of psychic activity moving outward from the throne room, spreading through the atmosphere and reaching orbit in seconds. Every mortal who felt the wave collapsed in shock, some trembling with fear, others weeping with relief. And on the bridge of every Imperial ship above Terra, captains stared in disbelief as their systems displayed one message over and over: "The Emperor walks," while the Astronomicon burned brighter than ever before, illuminating the warp so strongly that demons screamed as cracks formed in their twisted domains, revealing worlds of fire behind them. At the same time, on hundreds of distant planets, Imperial soldiers felt sudden strength return to their limbs, wounds closing, fear vanishing, and hope blooming where only despair had existed for centuries. For the Emperor's power was no longer tied to a machine but to his own will, which now surged across the galaxy like a rising dawn that nothing could stop. Yet within this overwhelming light, another presence stirred. Something ancient and buried deep within the Emperor's own being. A memory of the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. And as this memory surfaced, the Emperor paused, allowing his mind to touch the past once more, seeing the face of his fallen son, the moment Terra almost died, and he felt a cold determination sharpen inside him, like the edge of a blade, a resolve that the galaxy would never again stand at the mercy of traitors or Xeno's ambitions. Meanwhile, the High Lords of Terra, still trembling from the shock, gathered in their council chamber, arguing in panic about what this return meant. Some terrified their power would vanish, others fearful of his judgment. But their voices fell silent when the chamber lights dimmed, and a holographic projection activated by itself, showing the Emperor's silhouette as his voice echoed through the room, declaring that a new age was beginning, an age where the Imperium would rise stronger than ever, but only if unity replaced corruption and duty replaced fear, leaving the High Lords stunned as they understood that their era of comfortable rule was over. Out in the warp, the Chaos Gods gathered in a storm of rage and terror, realizing that the Emperor's awakening threatened their dominion more than any crusade before, and their shrieks echoed across the immaterial, summoning legions of demons and warlords, preparing a brutal war that would shake reality itself, while Abaddon, overwhelmed by the psychic roar, slammed his fist into the armrest of his throne, and ordered his fleets to prepare for the greatest campaign of their existence. Back on Terra, the Emperor reached the entrance of the throne room, and as the massive doors slid open to reveal the golden streets of the Imperial Palace, he saw millions kneeling, praying and crying as they looked upon his living form, and in that moment, he raised his hand not in anger but in calm authority, sending a wave of warmth through the crowd, lifting their spirits, strengthening their resolve, and reminding them that humanity's strength had never been in its weapons or armies, but in its will to survive no matter the cost. Then, with a single command that echoed across the entire Imperium, he announced the beginning of a new crusade, not one of blind conquest, but one of survival, unity, and vengeance against every force that had tried to break humanity for 10,000 years. And as his voice faded, the galaxy responded. Battle sirens blared. Ships activated plasma engines, soldiers raised banners, psychers steadied their minds against the burning brilliance of the Astronomicon, and entire sectors prepared for war, knowing that the Emperor himself was now leading them. And as the long night of the galaxy trembled under the coming storm, one final thought spread across the stars, like a whisper that refused to die. The Emperor had returned, and nothing, no demon, no Genos, no traitor, would ever be able to stop humanity's march toward its destiny again.